So let's talk about practically putting World Eaters on the tabletop, and what goes into making a strong army list for them in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where this week we've been talking World Eaters, and today I thought we'd take a focused look as to what makes a good World Eaters army, at least in the current Codex. With that in mind, I thought we'd talk about the competitive choices that I think most people are going to be choosing to put in their lists, and then go through 3 different examples with some slight variations. So first up, obviously at this point, World Eaters are a fairly new army to Warhammer 40k, and usually with new codexes there's a bit of a running in period where people try and unearth the hidden combos and what actually works practically well in game. With the World Eaters though, for kind of 2 different reasons, I feel like it's going to be a bit more simple than normal. First up, they are just a little bit single-minded as an army. Generally their efficient units just want to run up to you and hit you very hard with chain axes of one flavour or another. Quite a lot of their units have a bit of an overlap in the role that they're competing for, so you can directly compare them against each other. And also, at least compared with other codexes in 9th edition, the rules in the codex just maybe aren't quite as deep as most of the others. Games Workshop seem to have intentionally cut back on the bloat, with fewer options for things like stratagems, warlord traits, relics, and other stuff. Between all that, I feel like a lot of people just seem to have kind of worked out what works in the codex already, and I've already seen quite a lot of conversions on what people think is going to be strong in competitive lists. First up, when list building, I feel like there's 2 major choices you can make, either standard World Eaters versus Disciples of the Red Angel, and broadly either taking Angron or Lord Invocatus as the Warlord, as both have their merits. First up, at least to me and the vast majority of people I've seen theory crafting, people generally seem to agree that standard World Eaters are probably stronger than the Disciples of the Red Angel army of renown. I don't think that the Disciples are unusable, but probably just a little bit weaker on the whole. They do have some good stratagems, including a long advance one, and some helpful things for helping out 8-bound in combat. An objective secured 8-bound is certainly no bad thing. They're perhaps one of the most efficient units in the entire codex, so have them being a bit better at claiming objectives as they take the fight to the enemy is all well and good. In general though, I think that people are more looking at the World Eaters for a few different reasons. I'd say that the stratagems are just overall kind of better. The heroic intervention one and the fights and death one are both particularly nice, plus you miss out on a couple of good damage dealing ones for combat. Otherwise you also cut out some really good units like Berserkers and Rhinos, and the cheap effective blood tithe points that are Chaos Spawn. And also it kind of feeds into the next question, which is whether or not you take Lord Invocatus or Angron. In the Disciples of the Red Angel, you have to have it led by Angron. He has to be the Warlord, so you can't get Lord Invocatus' pre-game move. For those reasons, I feel like the Disciples of the Red Angel are going to be more a fun alternative way to play that still could be decently strong, but I guess probably isn't going to be top tier for World Eaters lists. Then you've got the choice of who is going to actually lead the army. I guess the choice is between Angron versus Lord Invocatus for the vast majority of lists. I guess you could have a generic character lead you for that blood tithe point boost, but I'd say that would probably be secondary to these 2. You can't take multiple warlord traits, and that's the thing that makes this really quite a big decision. I have talked about this in previous videos, but it does seem like the majority of competitive lists that I've seen are theory crafting around Lord Invocatus and not taking Angron at all. The reason for that is that Lord Invocatus has his Warlord trait with a ridiculously good pre-game move. You get to move him and 2 other units a normal move up into the middle of the board, likely 2 big units of 8-bound, so they move 11 inches on turn 0 basically, and then be set up for a first turn charge if you go first. It means that turn 1 you're potentially slamming home with around about 600 points worth of absolutely ferocious World Eaters melee, making a first turn charge on the enemy and killing a whole bunch of their stuff in their own deployment zone. It's really scary stuff. I suppose the opponent might be able to screen things out of it depending on their army, but against some armies they're just really not going to be able to deal with that. Of course the other choice is Angron the Primarch himself. It's kind of not too hard to see why he's pretty tempting though. Really powerful in terms of a ridiculous amount of melee. 39 attacks with strength 10 is pretty insane. It's a bit of a psychological weapon against the opponent. If you shoot him, he's likely to come back with blood tithe. He respawns, and then he can lock the enemy in melee with no falls back. He does have his downsides though. It's not that hard to gun down for the cost, even if he does come back. You can't hide him behind obscuring terrain like most units because he's got 18 wounds, and he will sap your blood tithe points a bit, which means that you won't get those powerful army-wide rules going in full until the end of the game likely. Overall, the majority of Hone's lists seem to prefer Lord Invocatus over Angron, though I still think that Angron is very usable and really quite cool. Angron will tend to have a bit more value I think in certain game types, say if you're playing on a massive tournament table with some enormous L-shaped ruins that can physically block line of sight to Angron. That's going to be a really big deal and make him a lot more usable, or potentially in small games where just the raw power of him is not going to be able to be matched by the opponent's army. Say if you're playing in a 1,000-point game, there's a good chance they're just not going to have the raw might to face a Demon Primarch respawning and deleting a chunk of their army each turn. He could be downright oppressive. Overall though, for a 100% optimised list, I'd probably go Lord Invocatus, though I think that in reality an Angron list really isn't all that far behind whatsoever. If Lord Invocatus got nerfed in some way, I feel it's likely that basically everyone will be playing Angron with his respawning. Then after that, it's the actual unit selections themselves. Here are just my thoughts for each section of the Codex in terms of what I've seen people picking. We've already talked about leaders for the army, Angron versus Lord Invocatus, but otherwise in the HQ section, I feel like a Demon Prince or Juggernaut Lord maybe isn't the worst to bear a relic. If you want one of the World Eaters relics, then you need to pick one of the generic characters. They seem more optimal than Master of Executions for that, as they have more raw combat power. The Juggernaut Lords may be interesting enough to give another chunk of your army +2 to move if you already got that somewhere with Lord Invocatus elsewhere, and the Demon Prince just has a lot more raw melee might plus some rerolls. I think he's very usable and is perhaps one of the best focal things for a buff like the -1 to wound relic. Otherwise, I feel that Master of Executions is very usable for 65 points. Perhaps the main issue with them, though, is that they take up spots in Rhinos. I think often people might want to have 2 units of Khorne Berserkers in a Rhino, both 5 models each, and if they take that, then the Master of Executions isn't going to fit as well. Kyler Betrayer I feel is probably a little bit suboptimal for his huge 140 points cost. Definitely not unusable though, he certainly packs a melee punch jumping out of a Rhino just like the Master of Executions. I think in terms of damage per point though, I'd rather have the Masters of Executions rather than Khan. For troops choices, I typically want to go for a fair amount of Khorne Berserkers, maybe something like 3 to 6 units of 5 of them in a list. Absolutely definitely give them an Eviscerator, maybe an Icon if you're feeling generous, particularly if they're foot slogging or not in a Rhino. I'd be tempted to buy a Rhino for the majority of them, though not necessarily all. Jackals I wouldn't go too heavy on, maybe 1 or 2 units in a 2,000 point list, grabbing home field objectives and doing other grunt work like actions. They are just a little bit annoyingly expensive for their defensive profile though, even if they aren't terrible in melee versus enemy light infantry. In the elite section, I'd be tempted by a fair amount of the new 8-bound. Games Workshop really do seem to have made them very tempting indeed. A lot of lists that I've seen theory crafting do generally tend to go on these fairly heavy as primary damage dealers, particularly if Lord Invocatus is about, then 2 big units of the standard 8-bound seem almost auto-include. They're some of the best users of his pre-game move, with their big 9-inch move plus 2-inch for him. A few small units of the Exalted ones seem great as well for some more independent moving threats. They don't need to stay with characters as they're not core. And getting an inbuilt 4+ invul, the chance to no fallback, and those dangerous chain fists is rather good. In the fast attack section, I feel like if you can possibly find points for them, then 3 individual units of Spawn are very good indeed. 75 points for 3 cheap annoying OBSEC units that give you Blood Tithe points is pretty crazy. Occasionally they'll annoyingly survive enemy shooting with their regeneration rule, and if they ever actually kill things in combat, or manage to hold an objective or something before they go down, generally you've got even better value out of a crazily cheap unit. Sometimes they might be just a little bit annoying to fit into a list for practicality's sake, but if you can run 3 of them, then I would. I think for the most part those are the ones that I generally want to build around as standards, and then everything else is maybe a bit more optional and depending on what flavour of list you want to run. I think that the Terminators are fine enough. I'd probably rate them as less overall efficient as the 8-bound with their big move, but they can add a little bit of firepower to the World Eaters army, and plus are a little bit more tough than most choices as well with their 2+ saves. I probably wouldn't go too heavy on them to be honest. I'd probably not take more than 1 unit, but it could be quite a good focal unit for big buffs, seeing as it's the biggest core unit. Angron could potentially throw his 4 rerolls on that unit before he goes winging off to smash something else. Otherwise, you could think about a bit of fire support. Obviously, it's not the main focus of the Codex, but a little bit of shooting can go a long way. Forge Fiends or Hellbrutes could be okay within the Codex. To be honest though, I'd be a bit more tempted by allies for that role. Perhaps allied Wardog Executioners or Brigands seem like one of the best options from the Chaos Knights, zipping around with objectives secured and some fairly decent guns. Or maybe Skull Cannons in the Khorne Demon Codex. They're fairly efficient seeing as they went down to 90 points. I feel like a patrol of Chaos Demons is pretty viable as well. You need to take less than a quarter of the list in terms of power level, but things like Bloodletters, Fleshhounds, Skulltaker, maybe a Bloodthirster or Scarbrand, and Skull Cannons all seem like decent options. Obviously, if you took Bloodthirsters or Scarbrand, then that would take up most of your allowance. Theoretically could be interesting if you're running either Angron or a Lord of Skulls. There's the potential to use the Warp Locust keywords to get them deep striking in close. Talking of which, I feel like the bigger vehicle options are at least fairly viable. Land Raiders, the Lord of Skulls, and the Brass Scorpion when the Forge World Compendium rules update. I generally rate Rhinos over Land Raiders for transports to get the World Eaters to the front, but there is something to be said for a big Toughness 9 pillbox for the Berserkers to charge out of. It's usually the sort of thing that should stand up to a turn of enemy shooting unless it's really excessive anti-tank. The Lord of Skulls and the Brass Scorpion both seem fine for the stats. I guess the Blood Tithe could give them a fair amount of extra value, but they are a huge whack of points and take up a lot of the list. Probably a bit suboptimal. I wouldn't expect most lists to run them, but not awful if you want to include them. Putting that all together, here's just one example of a list that I feel is maybe going to be fairly standard for competitive World Eaters, though obviously we'll have to see what people actually make of the changes and what does well when the armies are stress tested in tournaments. In the HQ section, we've got Lord Invocatus as the Warlord. He's going to be pre-game moving with the 8 bound, and a Demon Prince jumping around with sword, wings, and his gun, and a -1 to wound relic to make him harder to kill. His combat is pretty brutal with a high amount of strength 9, AP -3, damage 3. In the troop section, we've got 5 units of Khorne Berserkers, 4 of them with just Eviscerators, and they ride in 2 Rhinos, and then 1 unit with an Eviscerator and an Icon. They could start as a bit of a countercharge threat hiding behind terrain, or potentially even go in strategic reserve and try and make a long charge with their unique stratagem. I've also got 1 unit of 10 Jackals as well with a Skull Smasher. These ones are destined to hold down a home field objective for at least relatively cheap with Obsec, but if the enemy does move up to try and clear them, they can actually hit surprisingly hard in combat as a countercharge. Then in the elite section, for the primary damage dealers of the list, units going to be moving up and skirmishing with the enemy. We've got 3 units of Exalted 8 bound, each with a dual Chain Fist champion for a bunch of damage 3. Ideally their plan is going to be to try and hug cover wherever possible, and use their long movement to try and get the charge on the enemy before they get shot if they can. There's then 2 big scary units of 8 bound, each with a champion with dual lacerators for the damage 3. These guys ride out with Lord Invocatus. If you go first, then hopefully set up for a first turn charge. It should be fairly guaranteed to reach a lot of the enemy's deployment zone, or if you go second, then use the pre-game move just to get somewhere safe in the midfield where you can threaten a charge the next turn. In the fast attack section, there's 2 units of 1 spawn. Ideally I would have liked 3, but sometimes it can just fall a little bit awkwardly with the points. There's not a lot else in this list that you can cut. And then for transports, there's 2 Rhinos to move around with the Berserkers. Again, I feel like they're really quite efficient, and again can farm Blood Tithe points quite well as their vehicles. They'll aim to move up with those squads of Berserkers, and hopefully aim to hang around next to terrain, so if they're shot, then the Berserkers can pile out of line of sight. Overall, it basically is pure combat, this list, without much shooting whatsoever. Kind of expected for World Eaters, I suppose. But in terms of melee threats, there's 2 characters, 5 units of Berserkers, and 5 units of 8 bound, all of which will hit spectacularly hard when they do make it to the enemy. For an alternative take, here's one list that uses Angron instead of Lord Invocatus. He'll hide behind any huge terrain if there's any available, but otherwise just try and rush the enemy and break something as fast as possible, and repeatedly respawn himself with the Blood Tithe. There are 3 units of spawn and 2 Rhinos that should hopefully add to the tally. And for the Rhinos in this list, I decided to go with 1 unit of Khorne Berserkers in each with an Eviscerator and an Icon, and then a Master of Executions in each. Just a cheap fighty character with 7 attacks at strength 8, damage 2. Not sure if that's necessarily the way to go compared with more Berserkers, but they do seem at least fairly cheap and effective. In the elite section, there's 4 small units of 8 bound running around this time, 2 exalted and 2 standard ones, and this time to hold down backfield objectives and provide some ranged fire support, there's some allied Chaos Knight Dreadblades, 2 Wardog Executioners with the autocannons. They take the Worthy Offerings Dreadblade thing, where they get a +1 to hit against monsters and vehicles and things. At least on paper they seem like quite a nice choice for putting objectives secured on home field objectives, while providing some fairly solid fire support that the World Eaters usually lack. Hopefully the need to try and kill Angron just about each turn for the opponent should draw a bit of fire from them, and dilute the enemy anti-tank a bit. Finally, here's just a third idea with a Demon Patrol thrown in. This one's basically a slimmed down version of the first list. We've just got Lord Invocatus, 4 units of Berserkers and the 2 Rhinos, the Jackals, and slightly fewer 8 bound. But this time we've upgraded up to 3 spawn and thrown in some Chaos Demons as well. In the Demon Patrol we've got Skulltaker for a second character that can fight hard against enemy characters and ignore invul saves just like Lord Invocatus can. A unit of 10 Bloodletters that Skulltaker could potentially buff quite nicely if he wanted to, and then 2 fast Outrider units of Fleshhounds who are just incredibly efficient for 75 points and they're actually really quite tough for the cost as well, something that is pretty helpful in a World Eater's army. These guys are fast, tough, and relatively dangerous in combat, as opposed to being fast and fragile and very dangerous in combat, so I think it's nice to have a bit of both. Maybe quite good units to trade on exposed objectives where the opponent might actually struggle to chew through them. They potentially allow a bit of psychic denial and that stratagem to go off on a 3+ for the Chaos Demons as well, which is rather nice. Let me know your thoughts on World Eater's army lists down in the comments below though. What are you guys most tempted to run in Theory Land with the new Codex? What is looking strongest to you? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly be aiming to keep the regular 40k videos coming, and there should be plenty more for the World Eaters. I'll leave a link down to my World Eaters unit tier list down in the video description if you'd like to see something else on a similar theme. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description as well. If you'd like to help support, then channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.